Thanks so much for coming. I want to welcome you all to the NYU Reynolds Social Entrepreneurship in the 21st Century Speaker Series. My name is Gabriel Brodbar. I'm the Executive Director of the NYU Reynolds program. And I am thrilled and really very humbled to be welcoming our two guests tonight, Mr. Matthew Bishop, the U.S. editor, business editor for The Economist, and Mr. Andrew Kassoy, who's the co-founder of B Lab. Many of you probably know this is the 7th year of our speaker series, and over that time we've really had a number of extraordinary thinkers and change agents on the Reynolds stage, and I'm sure this evening will be no exception. But I'm particularly excited about tonight's event for two reasons. And the first reason is this to me feels a little bit like coming full circle. I had the good fortune of meeting Andrew for the first time about 8 years ago when we were launching the Reynolds program. And he was telling me about this really great organization that he was going to be launching called B Lab. And the idea was that B Lab was going to help create a new legal entity called a B Corp or a B Corporation. And the whole point of this B Corp was to help folks like you and I figure out the difference between companies that are really good on the one hand and companies that are pretending to be really good on the other hand, right? And we fast forward now, I guess, just about 8 years, and it is extraordinary where Andrew and his team has taken that idea. I would be willing to bet that everybody in this room has done business with at least one B Corp. If you have eaten Ben & Jerry's ice cream, you have...
It's a good place to start.
If you have cleaned up afterwards with 7th generation products, you have. If you shopped at Patagonia, maybe for some outdoor wear to work off some of that ice cream, you have. If you've read Good Magazine, if you've purchased eyeglasses upstairs here at Warby Parker, if you have bought anything online at Etsy or at one of 700 other businesses worldwide, you have done business with a B Corp. It is an extraordinary story of starting and very rapidly scaling what's become a genuine movement. The second reason I'm so excited about tonight's event is we get to learn from and really celebrate how that movement is legitimately changing our world. In my opinion, what B Corp has really done is realize one of the fundamental tenets of what social entrepreneurship is all about. And that's the marketplace has a fundamental and necessary role to play in helping to build a more sustainable future. I know we're going to learn a lot today about B Corp, B Lab, and the role that business can, must, and does play in contributing positively to social change. The conversation tonight is going to be led by Matthew Bishop, probably one of the leading thinkers on the relationship between saving the world and the economy. In addition to his work at the Economist, he is the author of, co-author with Michael Green on several books on the subject, including most recently Capitalism, How to Save the World. We're really thrilled that he's decided to lead the conversation, which all of you can participate in during our Q&A session, which will follow. So please join me in very warmly welcoming to NYU Reynolds, Mr. Andrew Kassoy and Mr. Matthew Bishop.
Well, thank you very much. And it's just great to have this opportunity to spend time with Andrew talking about this genuinely big idea for reforming capitalism, for making the kind of philanthrocapitalism that I had in mind, which brings together social mission and being businesslike. Great to explore how this idea came about, how it's growing, and where it might go in the future. I thought to start, Andrew, it would just be good to get a sense of who you are and how you came to this point of launching B Lab and then where it's gone since. Just give us a bit of your personal story.
So I was born, well, let's see. I spent 16 years actually in the private equity industry. So I had a pretty when I got out of college, at the time, not to date me too much, but this was 1991, and at the time, there was no sense that you could have sort of build a career that both was about business and purpose at the same time. Like, you either went into public service, like join a nonprofit or go into politics, or you go work in business to make money, or you go become a starving artist. But like, you made that decision, and there was no overlap. And so when I got out of college, I got a job in the private equity industry, and I spent the next 16 years at a series of Wall Street firms, and then working for Michael Dell's family office, which is called MSD Capital and is based here, and was a pretty traditional investor. Bought buildings and companies all over the world, and mostly just sort of focused on doing that, without much thought about what else was happening in the world.
So what started to change your mind?
So, I mean, I had always been pretty interested in social justice issues, and had maybe way back when thought I might be interested in politics or public service, and then had just sort of ended up on this career path. And at some point, I picked up my head and started to realize I was doing pretty well. I was making lots of money, rising up through the ranks in a Wall Street investment institution, and I also suddenly realized that I was not all that happy, because it didn't really feel like it had all that much meaning, and it wasn't really having much impact other than on my bank account. Unfortunately, I'm not like a wake up one morning and have an epiphany and change my life kind of person. So I think I realized this, and then it took me 3 or 4 more years after that to actually do anything about it. But what actually started me on a path towards doing something about it was that I met somebody that lots of you guys have probably seen speak, Cheryl Dorsey, who runs Echoing Green, which is provides a little bit like Ashoka seed stage funding to social entrepreneurs, and has been doing it for 20-something years now, and sort of an iconic institution. And she convinced me to join the Echoing Green board. And I did that because I thought, wow, this is really cool. There are all these social entrepreneurs. They're like business people. At the time, most of them were nonprofits, but they were sort of acting in a very entrepreneurial, business-like way, but with a social objective for their organization. And I got very inspired by a lot of these people, and a number of them started coming to meet with me to get advice on, how to scale their organization, and probably because they wanted money. One of the people that I met was Sarah Horowitz, who probably a lot of you have also heard of. But Sarah won a MacArthur Genius Award for realizing that the union movement was in the U.S. was in trouble, and one of the reasons it was in trouble was because a third of workers are independent workers now and don't work for regular kinds of companies. And
she founded the Freelancers Union.
And she founded the Freelancers Union, and she was struggling to figure out, well, how do you grow that? How do you provide health insurance to people who otherwise couldn't get it as independent workers? And was realizing that actually the way to do that would be to create a business, a for-profit business. That would be the best way to scale what was a mission-driven organization. And it was actually the process of working with her on a business plan to turn that into a for-profit institution that made me realize that there were actually tons and tons of social entrepreneurs who were already creating for-profit businesses that had a social mission, and that there ought to be a way to build a capital market to help all of those businesses that were driven by mission or purpose grow.
So at that point, though, as you looked around, there didn't seem to be a corporate form that suited that kind of social entrepreneur with a mission.
Right. So there was no center of gravity, really. Like, there were no institutions at all. And it's sort of hard to believe now, kind of 6 or 7 years later, because there are so many organizations now that are trying to address various problems involved in trying to build a market for social entrepreneurs. But at the time there was no corporate form to help any of these entrepreneurs succeed in scaling while maintaining their mission. There were no standards. by which to measure the difference between a good company and good marketing. There was not like a capital market. There was no sort of definable place to go or set of investors who were interested in putting capital to work, and that makes for a pretty inefficient and therefore dysfunctional market. Like, markets don't work like that.
So you came up with this idea of the B Corp.
Yeah.
Or was it B Lab first and then
yeah,
B Corp?
I mean, it's actually it was again, like, I wish we had been sitting there over some beers and said, like, hey, we should start a B Corp. What actually happened was that two of my best friends from college from years ago, who are entrepreneurs who actually had a much more exciting career than me, they started a basketball footwear and apparel business called And One, which they grew from the garage into like
Which was kind of dubious, wasn't it, in terms of...
Totally dubious. I mean, these guys, so after we got out of college, I'm running around Wall Street in my suit. These guys are like, what we should really do is try to compete with Nike. Because there's really a market opportunity there. And so they actually started by making, in all seriousness, they realized that there was a huge opportunity amongst like kids who play basketball, wanting to have like an authentic brand that they could call their own. And so what they did was they started making trash-talking T-shirts that they sold in playgrounds all over the country. They said stuff like, "If I give you $5, will you go home?" Or maybe a little more dubiously, "Your game's uglier than your girlfriend," or things like that. And those T-shirts caught on, and then eventually they started making basketball shoes, and they literally did compete with Nike, and they were the second biggest seller of basketball shoes after Nike for a few years. And they grew that into a $250 million brand. What's more interesting than how cool the brand was, though, was that they realized that they wanted to run a company that had sort of responsibility built into it. And I wouldn't say social mission in the sense that they're making basketball footwear and apparel, so there's not like a mission to that. But they wanted to build a business where it was a place that people actually wanted to come to work. Really importantly, when you're making basketball shoes, you're manufacturing them in developing world countries, and so they wanted to have the highest manufacturing code of conduct. So they were focused on, and they wanted to give money away in communities where they sold their product. And so they were focused on having a company with good practices. And they went through this experience of having to sell that business because they had a bunch of mainstream venture investors who said, time to sell. 7 years are up or whatever it was, and it's time to sell. And at that point, they had to sell the company to the highest bidder. And it didn't matter that the highest bidder might be the one who saw the most opportunity to get rid of all of those great practices in order to increase margins. None of that mattered. It wasn't their company. It was the investor's company, and their duty by law, Delaware law, is to maximize value for shareholders.
And the venture capitalists basically forced them to sell.
Yeah, said it's time to sell, and you're going to sell to that person because that person's willing to pay the most. So that's sort of a long way of getting to, the two of them were selling that business at the same time and thinking about how do you actually create a business that is able to maintain its mission over the long haul. So they were sort of thinking about that as operators at the same time that I was kind of coming around to this conclusion as an investor that there had to be a different way to think about driving capital to those same kinds of businesses. And so it was really that process of the three of us sort of starting to think about it that led eventually to creating B Lab. And actually it didn't start with trying to build a global movement to redefine success in business. It actually started as we should start a new business that is built to last. And looking around and realizing actually there's 100,000 entrepreneurs in the US who self-identify as being mission driven. And so we said actually we don't need to be another one of those. We should actually provide capital to them. And so we came up with this idea that we would create a holding company that could invest over a very long period of time in these kinds of businesses. Sort of Warren Buffett's Berkshire Hathaway. We were going to create that, but for investing in socially driven businesses. We were going to call it B Holdings. And when we started talking to investors, it was the process of starting to talk to investors who said, that sounds great, but how are you going to decide what you're investing in and how are you going to measure how much impact you're having? That we started to look around and realize that actually there's no system for this. So maybe our highest and best use in life is to try to build the systems that will facilitate everybody else being able to
And I mean, I identify you with two particular initiatives. I mean, one being this creation of the B Corp legislation and your efforts to try and spread that around the country and perhaps the world. And then on the other hand, this creation of something called GEARS,
Yep.
GIIRS,
Yep.
which is really about trying to measure the broad impact that any institution has, both in terms of its financial, social, and environmental impact in a way that's standardized across many different institutions. Let's start with the B Corp.
Yep.
And just tell us what a B Corp is, how it differs from other corporations. Because I mean, I guess American corporate law is pretty complicated,
Right.
and what's unique about the B Corp?
So where we started was actually that we should create not a new corporate form, but a certification, sort of like a LEED certification for green buildings or fair trade certification for coffee. We said there should be a certification that makes good easy for consumers, for investors, for policymakers, for people going to work at companies, and when we looked at sort of the two, what we thought were sort of the two systematic problems in the market, one was about standards and one was about corporate form. We said, great, the certification needs to address those two things. The way you know a company is a good company is two things. One, it meets a minimum set of performance standards that look at its overall impact on society and the environment. And the second thing was that it commits itself, legally obligates itself to consider the interests of its stakeholders when it makes decisions. And so we said, that's what we'll do. We'll create a certification. It'll be called a B Corp, and it'll be companies that agree to do those two things. So the standards, we looked around and said, somebody must have like a rating system that we can use. Turned out no one had a rating system that we could really use that looked at the impact of a business on all of its stakeholders. And so we built one. It's called the B Impact Rating System, and eventually it was what created what you're talking about, GEARS. I'll come back to that in a sec. And then the second thing was we said these companies need to actually change their corporate articles. So they write into their corporate articles some language that says that they will consider the interests of their stakeholders, not just their shareholders, when they make decisions. So they expand their fiduciary duties, make themselves more broadly accountable. And that those are the two components of B Corp certification. What happened along the way was we realized the legal piece of that you could only do so much because existing law is mostly an impediment to that. And without like a long legal lecture, basically U.S. corporate law is done state by state. Every state's got its own corporate laws, which makes it really complicated, and all of them allow you to do different things. So as we looked around, one of the things we pretty quickly realized, though, is that most companies look to Delaware law. That's where I think 60-some-odd% of companies are incorporated in Delaware, and most of the Fortune 500, it's where all the venture capital and private equity investors incorporate companies. And when we looked at Delaware law specifically, it became pretty clear you couldn't even, if you wanted to, you couldn't add language to your articles. Even if your shareholders voted to do it, you can't, under Delaware law, add language to your corporate articles that says that you will consider something other than profits. And in fact, there are a couple of court cases where the Delaware courts have ruled that. And so we were going along certifying companies in lots of states around the country and actually now globally. But we realized that we could never scale this movement into mainstream business if we didn't address this underlying problem that there's just not a corporate form that's conducive to businesses that think about something other than profit. And that led us to decide that we ought to pursue the creation of a new corporate form, which was a pretty radical notion 3 years ago when we started doing that.
And so you got a bunch of lawyers together and...
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I think is really interesting about this whole movement is like there's lots of stuff that's all about like systems change and cool stuff, and then when it really comes down to it, it's all about individuals who just commit themselves to do something. A lawyer at a firm in Philadelphia called Drinker Biddle, which is a big mainstream white shoe law firm, a lawyer named Bill Clark, who's a senior corporate lawyer, pretty conservative guy, heard this story, and he said, yeah, I'm in. I will help you guys create a new corporate form. And so he sat with us over the course of 6 months, and basically we went to law school with Bill. And we had a blank piece of paper, and we tried to figure out like what needs to go into a corporate form for it to, on one hand, be attractive to investors, allow businesses to scale with mainstream capital, even go public someday, and on the other hand, have an expanded set of fiduciary duties that ensure that the business will actually maintain mission, that it's accountable to create benefit for stakeholders, not just for shareholders. And so he's probably done, over the last 3 years, 700 or 800 hours a year, which is 40% of a law firm partner's time, pro bono, writing this legislation and then traveling around the country, meeting with bar associations in every state around the country.
And so the first state to get B Corp legislation was?
First state was Maryland.
When was that?
That was in early 2010. It happened, again, like this always comes down to individuals. I mean, I literally met at a cocktail party a state senator in Maryland named Jamie Raskin, constitutional lawyer, who sort of heard this story and said after a couple of drinks, we should do this in Maryland. In fact, I'm going to have somebody call you on Monday and get a draft in, and we're gonna pass it now.
This is the real meaning of social entrepreneur, isn't it? That you get people to be entrepreneurial over a few drinks.
Enough drinks, right? Enough cocktails, and people will do a lot of things.
Yeah.
He and I was kind of like, yeah, politician. I'm sure that'll happen. And Monday went by, no phone call, and I don't remember anymore, but either Tuesday or Wednesday, somebody called up and said, "Hi, I'm so-and-so from Senator Raskin's office. He'd like a draft of the legislation. We need to, it needs to be introduced. We have a 2-week window to introduce legislation." And literally this got introduced, and over the course of the next 2 months, vetted through the Bar Association in Maryland. The governor, Martin O'Malley, the governor of Maryland, got very excited about it. And a couple months later, Maryland had passed, it was the first state in the country to create a new corporate form called the Benefit Corp.
And how quickly did you then get a company register under that legislation?
So 7 companies, the day that legislation became effective, a few months later, 7 companies showed up at 6 o'clock in the morning at the Secretary of State's office and literally were like elbowing each other for who was going to be first. And I think in the end we declared it a tie, but they all have on their websites, we are the world's first benefit corp.
Mm. And then the big breakthrough was California, I think, which was last year? Was that last year?
Vermont did it at the same time, and then in 2011, 5 more states did it, including California and New York. And that was really the breakthrough, was the 2 of them passed it. You have serious bar associations in those states, real opposition from some lawyers who just can't, just unacceptable that a business would act differently than what Milton Friedman said, and then that what they have been teaching in law school about what corporate law says.
Now, so far you've not mentioned Delaware.
Right.
Are we going to win Delaware? Is that going to happen?
Yeah, so Delaware is about to happen, I think. I'll knock on something. We all should, do whatever little. We interestingly, we met with, so Maryland is next door to Delaware, for those of you who are geographically challenged, and the governor of Maryland, when he passed legislation, said we are now the home. If Delaware is the home of the corporation, we are now the home of the sustainable corporation. Delaware appropriately read that as a strong shot across the bow and a threat to the franchise. And so we went and we met at the time with the governor and the Secretary of State and the Chancellor of the Chancery Court, which is sort of like the Supreme Court for business. And they all told us the same thing. The way Delaware functions is we will watch. We'll let everybody else sort of make the mistakes, try to figure this out, and then we will do it better. And so, and they said when the LLC legislation, the wave of LLC legislation in the 80s and 90s, Delaware I think was not first; they were 23rd maybe or something like that. So halfway through the pack. But
What's LLC legislation?
LLCs are limited liability companies, so sort of like partnerships, and probably the second most popular after corporations. LLCs are probably the most used corporate form, and so Delaware waited a while to see how other states did that, and so they're pretty conservative. So they've been watching. There are now 12 states plus Washington, D.C. that have passed benefit corp legislation, and just in the last 2 months, 17 more states have introduced it. And so that acceleration, where pretty quickly here, nearly half the states will have benefit corp laws, has caused Delaware to wake up and take notice. And so over the last couple of months, through a pretty tough process, they have drafted draft benefit corp legislation for Delaware. You can imagine that the corporation franchise in Delaware is like the bread and butter of Delaware. I think something like a third of Delaware's budget comes from corporation fees, and so they take very seriously that this is done in the right way, and so they've been through a long process with the Delaware corporate bar, which actually yesterday approved draft legislation. So that draft legislation will now go to will get introduced in the Delaware legislature probably later in April, and then probably pretty quickly go through the process in May and early June, after which hopefully Delaware will have benefit corp legislation. But it's been a tough process with them. Like, they started in one place that I would have said was unacceptable. Like, we wouldn't have been able to support it because it was very watered down. And over time, they have come to understand how important it is that if you're going to create a new corporate form, it needs to be truly distinct from the existing one and have a high set of standards so that there can be sort of restored trust in business. Mm-hmm. And they've moved themselves there.
So just to recap, I mean, by the end of this year, you're hopeful that more than half the states will have passed this legislation?
Yeah, hopefully something around half, including Delaware.
What about internationally? Are we seeing similar trends?
So I think it's early still, but in the last 3 or 4 months, there's been a ton of interest in the corporate form, specifically from policymakers. So the president of Chile is about to introduce benefit corp legislation in Chile, and there's been a bunch of interest from a number of countries in Europe and a number of countries in South America, India, Taiwan. It's been interesting, I think, particularly with Delaware saying they're going to do it. It creates a kind of credibility. But it also speaks, I think, to the power of entrepreneurs. Like, the only reason this has happened is because all of these social entrepreneurs who run these businesses show up and they demand of their legislators, their policymakers, that they do something to help them. And so even with, traditional lawyers sometimes opposed to it, or, people who kind of don't understand a different way of doing business, it's these folks who are coming out of the woodwork and saying, like, we want to do business with them.
This is a very interesting theme, isn't it? That, I guess social entrepreneurship is now, somewhere around 20 years old. It's really been, at least in terms of people calling it social entrepreneurship. Yeah. And yeah. I'm off next week to Oxford for the Skoll World Forum on Social Entrepreneurship, which is marking its 10th anniversary. And so it's a relatively new movement. And it's interesting to see this sort of growing demand for profit, to sort of harness the profit motive alongside the motive to achieve social progress. And what do you make of that trend? What is it that's driving so many social entrepreneurs to want to be more like a business as opposed to like a charity?
It's a good question. There's been this transition. When Bill Drayton was originally talking about social entrepreneurship.
This is the founder of Ashoka.
Yeah, and who you've spent obviously lots of time with. I think most of that was talking about was nonprofit organizations that were trying to scale to solve a social problem, and there wasn't necessarily a business model involved. I think there's been this shift in people starting to recognize, and I think it's partially come from this recognition that government and the nonprofit sector can't go it alone. They can't attract capital and they can't attract talent at scale that's sufficient to solve some of the biggest problems we have. It's not that they're not necessary, they're critical. And I think sometimes people make this mistake of saying, oh, markets can solve all of our problems, and I don't believe it. But I think it's more that the nonprofit and government sector are necessary, but they're not sufficient. And business just dominates, the private sector dominates our lives. It's 75 or 80% of GDP in the US, and similarly large in a lot of places. So it has to be changed. And at the same time, I think there's this generation of younger entrepreneurs, lots of you who are coming out of school and they want to start businesses. They would like to actually do well. There's nothing wrong with that, but they want to do that while doing good. So in many ways, I think it's kind of a natural evolution that comes from a recognition that there are more ways than just having a nonprofit to solve big social and environmental problems.
I thought it was very interesting that the talk from this year's TED conference that seems to have touched a nerve more than any other was this talk by Dan Pallotta, who wrote this book called Uncharitable. Yeah. And his argument was that basically the whole charity model basically punishes the person that wants to actually improve society by forcing them to accept lower levels of pay and a lower quality of life outside of whatever they're doing in their work. And it is sort of interesting that that's now had well over 1 million views since he gave it about a month ago. And I mean that's an idea that is very interesting, but I think plays into this whole thing of how reasonable is it to do well while doing good. And do you have a sense of, I mean, is the B Corp going to be paying the sort of salaries that Goldman Sachs pays, or is it a?
Well, that's an interesting question. I mean, I think so. At some level, I would say this is maybe more of a personal.
Is Goldman Sachs going to become a B Corp?
No, I don't think Goldman Sachs is going to become. I don't think Goldman Sachs is going to become a B Corp soon. And
right.
But this does get to sort of like direct impact versus demonstration effect of these kinds of organizations, and we can talk a lot about a critique here. Goldman Sachs is huge, and it's not getting a lot smaller. And the whole B Corp movement probably doesn't employ as many people as Goldman Sachs all by itself, or Walmart, or today. And so there is this, it's going to take a long time. But I mean, to like your core question, I do think there's such a thing as enough. So most B Corps are probably not going to pay people like Goldman Sachs might. But on the other hand, most B Corps are paying people, they've got to compete for talent. And so, they pay real private sector salaries. And the entrepreneurs who create those businesses, if they're successful in creating those businesses and scaling them, they make a lot of money. I mean, Yvon Chouinard, who runs Patagonia, is a really wealthy guy. He happens to have chosen to give all that wealth away and to do really good things with the profits of his company as well as with the practices of his company. But yeah, he's become really wealthy from creating a great business, and I don't think there's anything wrong with that. Those companies really have to compete. I mean, it's ironic. B Lab is a nonprofit, the organization I work for, and there's no question. It's really hard for us to attract talent. People are sacrificing when they come to work at B Lab because we pay close to private sector salaries, but we're also reliant on philanthropy and constantly out there with a begging bowl, and that makes it very hard to pay. And so I do think these kinds of businesses I think have a greater chance of succeeding than most nonprofits at solving a problem because they can attract talent.
I wonder whether you should be like Endeavour, which some people will know about, which is a network that supports high-impact entrepreneurs in developing countries, which has now gone from being entirely a philanthropically funded organisation to one where the companies they help, or the entrepreneurs they help,
right,
are giving them some equity,
right,
and then when they go on and go public or sell or whatever, money is paid into building up Endeavour and making that self-sustaining, and perhaps there's a similar model there for you.
So the B Lab, when we started, we wanted to have a sustainable business model as a nonprofit. We did not, it's 3 people coming from the private sector. We had absolutely no interest in trying to raise philanthropy. And we, with great hubris, believed that in 3 to 5 years that we would be totally sustainable from the revenue stream, basically from certifying companies as B corporations. So companies do pay a license fee to be certified. And it's been 7 years, and we are a third of the way towards being sustainable. So talk about bad business judgment.
So what does Gears bring in a revenue?
Yeah, so we also
so
we created the same set of standards that we use to certify B corporations as this impact investing movement. Basically, more and more people wanting to put their capital to work in these kinds of businesses. As impact investing has become kind of a recognized idea, one of the recognitions has been you need standards.
What does GEARS stand for?
So GEARS stands for the Global Impact Investing Rating System. So we basically took our set of standards that we use for certifying corporations and we branded it, we created a new brand, and we rate companies on their social and environmental impact. So we wanted to be able to do something more broadly than just the B Corp community, so other companies can get ratings from us and use those ratings to help them raise capital. And so we also get a fee stream comes from that as well. And so
how many companies have used that?
There are now about 380 companies that have gotten GEARS rated. There are 700 B corporations. There are about 70 private equity and venture capital funds that are, as funds are getting rated. And then there are about 25 institutional investors like UBS or Prudential or JP Morgan that are using the data from those ratings to help them make impact investing decisions. And all of those different revenue streams are starting to lead towards sustainability for B Lab, but it's still several years away. I do think you make a great point that one of the things that Endeavour has started to do is actually create investment vehicles that invest in those businesses that they are working with. And that's back to this original idea that we had about B Holdings, that we should really create a holding company that invests in B corporations. There's not enough hours in the day, but at some point that'll happen, whether it's us doing it or somebody else. But there is an opportunity there.
No, I recently interviewed John Mackey, who is the
Yep.
chief executive and founder of Whole Foods Market, and just written this terrific book called Conscious Capitalism.
Yeah.
And his narrative, very interesting, but I asked him specifically about B Corps and he doesn't like them.
Yeah.
And I'll just come back to
Yeah.
you with that. But his narrative is very interesting because, he is saying that the whole Milton Friedman view of capitalism and business, that the duty of business is to maximize profits subject to the rule of law. But that's basically all it should be thinking about. You shouldn't be thinking about broader social issues and so forth. He says that's completely wrong, and that narrative in capitalism for the last 25 years has led capitalism off into a very bad place, and that essentially capitalists have to rediscover their sense of social mission. And as he's done with Whole Foods, it's about healthy eating, well-produced crops that are good for the planet and good for the people that consume them. And he says that's the sort of, he doesn't think about maximizing profits at all. He thinks about maximizing the benefit he gives to the customer.
Right.
But his point was that he felt that he was more able to do that within a traditional business model, traditional corporate law, where he really sought out shareholders who supported him and were willing to be loyal to his mission, understanding the kind of trade-offs that might have to be made in the short term. So he didn't really spout the normal argument that you get from chief executives about how the market pressure makes you too short-term to do all these virtuous things in the long term. So he was saying that it's easier to do it that way, and that B Corp, in a way, brings in all this vagueness about, how is the investor really going to trade? How can you give your money to this company when it could just say, well, actually, frankly, I'm going to give all the money to my workers and pay them a lot of money, and you're never going to see a penny back. It's actually, and they have no way to go to law to sort of demand some kind of justice in terms of their own investment money. I mean, how do you respond to that?
So first of all, John Mackey has built a phenomenal business with Whole Foods that has enabled thousands of other sustainable businesses to have a platform, right, a place to sell their product and then to scale, and that's made it possible for the organic movement and the fair trade movement and lots of other things in the world of food to flourish. So much of the credit for that goes to him for creating Whole Foods. And I'd say Whole Foods is a B Corp without calling itself that. John has a very specific critique of, it's less about the B Corp certification, actually, and more about the legal form. So he has a very interesting kind of contradictory view. He considers himself a libertarian, like Milton Friedman. He just thinks Milton Friedman had too narrow a vision of what that means.
He actually had a very interesting debate a few years ago with
Milton Friedman, yeah, right before Milton Friedman died. It's actually a phenomenal debate, actually, to read. It was on maybe the 30th anniversary or the 35th anniversary of Milton Friedman's article in the New York Times Sunday magazine, where he famously said the social responsibility of businesses to maximize wealth for shareholders or something like that. That's totally worth reading. I think it was in Reason.
Yeah, Reason magazine.
His argument is that essentially that he's creating long-term value, and that you need to be answerable to somebody in doing that, and that somebody needs to be the shareholders, and that if you have confusion about who your duties are to, you can't run the business with a clear sense of purpose. And therefore, what he doesn't like about the benefit corp model is that he thinks it means that the stakeholders of the business have something to say about how the business is run, which actually isn't true. So he has a factual misperception about the benefit corp. The way the law actually works is that the only accountability is still to the shareholders. It's just that the shareholders can hold the directors accountable for creating more than just financial value for themselves. So for the investor who wants to invest in a company that's committed itself to do something other than just maximize wealth, the benefit corp works great, because the investor knows that that's actually going to happen. And if the company decides to say, screw it, we've got your money, and now we're going to just try to make money, we don't care about the social mission, the investor has the right to sue the company to do what they're supposed to do.
You use that great American word, sue.
Yeah.
I mean, so what's the legal?
Yeah.
Is this all going to be tested in courts?
It will eventually be tested in the courts. So when I say sue, I think this is really important. One of the things that people really hate about shareholder activism in the U.S. is it's like these endless lawsuits where directors are being sued for gazillions of dollars. So one of the things we did with the benefit corp legislation was to say there's not necessarily financial damages that are done when the company decides to quit paying attention to its social obligations. The damage that's done is that it stopped doing what it said it was supposed to do, and what I, as an investor, put my money to work for. Like, it stopped trying to help people in poorer communities, or it stopped trying to have a zero carbon footprint, or whatever it is. And so what we actually created was not monetary damages as a remedy, but what's called injunctive relief for specific performance. I'm not a lawyer, but basically the idea is you can go to a judge and say, this company committed to create public benefit. I'm a shareholder of this company. I invested in it because it was supposed to be creating public benefit, and they're not doing it now. Make them do what they said they would do. And the judge has the right to say, no, the company needs to go back and do what it said it was going to do. And so you avoid this culture of monetary lawsuits while trying to get to what you're actually trying to get to, which is making sure that the business can maintain its mission.
But I guess it's going to take quite a few people challenging
it will take.
what management does to figure out what's
the right
judged as a
balance?
legal balance.
What's the right
between
balance? I think that's absolutely right.
different
It's going
stakeholders
to
and
take,
so forth.
it will take time. And just like the courts in Delaware are constantly ruling on these issues around fiduciary duty, with existing corporate law, they will start to create a body of law over the next 10 or 20 years that will start to help create, that will create the box in which this exists and what the parameters are. And so, I think this one thing this gets to is how long this is going to take. Like, we are not talking about, I think, a revolution in capitalism. I think we're talking about an evolution of capitalism that's just going to take a while.
Because I guess even if you get the legislation in Delaware, you're not going to see all the existing Fortune 1000 companies sort of suddenly switch.
Right. Imagine
Overnight,
Walmart, the shareholder vote at Walmart when they announced that they'd like the shareholders to vote on changing their corporate form. I think that that's going to take a few years.
So who is going to use the legislation?
So I think what will happen is that the first companies to do it will be companies that will go public as benefit corporations. So they won't be existing public companies. I think there will be a bunch of companies that are currently B Corps, like Etsy or Method Home Products or Patagonia or people like that. Patagonia has already become a benefit corp in California. But companies like that will do it in Delaware, and then they'll go public. And that will start to create a market and start to create the test cases and things like that that will eventually allow public companies to do it. And it might be that a public company that has maybe a majority shareholder will do it first, like a New York Times company or something like that. But I think it'll be, there'll be a transition there. People will wait to see that there's actually that there's a body of law starting to develop.
Well, do you think at that point a Walmart could be changed? I guess that would have to be driven by the employees fundamentally, wouldn't it?
I think the employees and the consumers of companies, but I think all of these, a lot of these big companies are starting to change. I don't know. I would say when we think about what our vision is that, what we're doing is trying to create a global movement to redefine success in business. And that once we've done that, we'll create a climate in which all companies can compete, not just to be best in the world, but best for the world.
I mean, it is striking, just in the few years since I wrote Philanthropic Capitalism, how business, the leading business executives now feel they want to talk about their social mission in a way that was very different from what the case was 5 years ago. I'm currently working on an article about Unilever, which is really extraordinary, trying to basically set itself the target of doubling its profits whilst halving its carbon footprint and improving the well-being of 1 billion more people.
Yeah.
Which is a kind of ambitious mission. I mean, that is as far as any company has gone, and it's doing that as a regular for-profit company. So it's kind of interesting how much movement there's been even in that space. But what I wanted to ask...
I think part of that is there are a few journalists over the last few years who've caught on to this and started to write about it. And I think when people who are mainstream journalists, like you're at The Economist writing about that, it starts to create an air of credibility or acceptability or even inevitability that regular businesses can start to change the way they think. And then on top of that, I think you're right about the workers. We more and more hear companies saying they're becoming B Corps because it helps them attract talent. There's a war out there, and particularly for big companies, they have to attract talent if they're going to continue to succeed. And people like lots of you coming out of school actually care about where they go to work in a way that they didn't when I was getting out of school. That the place that they go to work reflects their values and who they are. And so I think that's huge.
Now, a bit of advice for social entrepreneurs. I mean, as you're a social entrepreneur, you've had this idea for changing the world, and you're trying to figure out what kind of structure, business structure, organizational structure you take. When should you decide that you want to be a B Corp?
So this is, I think, very important. I was struck Echoing Green has seen this transition of people applying for fellowships, more and more of them for profit.
I mean, 5 years ago, no one was
No
for
one,
profit.
almost no one.
Now
And,
most
and
are.
now, at least probably half, I'm guessing. But one of the interesting observations is now there's been such a shift, and everybody's talking about impact investing, and that everybody thinks that for everything they're doing, they should start a for-profit business. And I think that's like an overcorrection. So the first thing I'd say is, there are lots of things that you can do that are about solving a social problem that have no business being a business. There is no business model. There is no way to earn revenues that are going to exceed expenses, that are going to allow investor to get a return, and that are going to allow you to scale. And therefore, there are things you might be really passionate about that you want to start that shouldn't be a business. They should be a nonprofit, and they should raise philanthropy. And and you've spent lots of time with a lot of the, like the folks with the Giving Pledge. There's more and more philanthropy out there, and so it's really important from the start to know why you're trying to do what you're doing and what the model is, and lots of things shouldn't be.
And I guess what they're looking for is a path to impact rather than necessarily a path to any kind of revenue or profit.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. And then I think the second thing is that if you want to build a great business, you should build it to be great from the start. To quote Jim Collins. And so if it's got a social mission, building in a legal form that ensures that when you go out to raise capital for that business, that you're communicating clearly to investors what you're all about, and therefore getting the right investors is absolutely the most important thing that you can do. So whether it's actually using the Benefit Corp legal form or just clearly communicating to your investors what you're trying to achieve, I think that's a really important thing. Otherwise, you
And the Benefit Corporation doesn't have any tax advantages of the kind that a non-profit would have, or?
No, not yet.
Yeah.
And I think, there's some interesting questions about public policy and incentives that will start to come up as more and more of these companies can prove that they're internalizing this.
Last question is we're now going to throw it over to the audience, but the last question for me is really, you've been talking a lot about impact investing, and this has definitely been a term that has been come from nowhere to being talked about, at least on quite a large scale. JP Morgan 2 or 3 years ago wrote a report saying this could be $1 trillion asset class by 2020. A number I think they kind of pulled out of the air, but it's kind of some, ambition. And directionally interesting. And it's so this notion that you can invest in. There's this huge wall of capital waiting to find opportunities that are going to give a financial return and a clear, measurable social or environmental benefit. I mean, how do you think that whole impact investing movement is going so far? Is it living up to expectations? What are the challenges, opportunities you're seeing?
So having spent a career as an investor, I am pretty skeptical of investors. And I think, so investors are clearly, there's an incredible amount of talk about impact investing. Everybody, as you said, everybody says they're an impact investor now, and so, there's a question about what meaning that is, and that is back to the importance of something like years, and actually measuring what kind of impact is taking place, and this doesn't just become a marketing term. I do think there's a lot more talk than actual action. And there's a couple of reasons for it. One is that most of the impact investment opportunities that are out there today are still small. Most of them are young entrepreneurs who started businesses who are trying to solve a social problem either here or in the developing world. And they can only absorb so much capital. And on the other hand, the big financial institutions like the JP Morgans that are talking about impact investing, they can't, it's hard for them to function unless there's at least 9 zeros after a number. Just the magnitude of those institutions is such that they just get their attention or to make an investment opportunity viable, it has to be huge. And so there's a mismatch there between like the investable opportunities, the products, and the desires of those investors. And so as a result, a lot of institutions are kind of circling around this space, and they're talking about creating impact investing products, but they can't really quite find enough to actually do. And so it's still a lot of talk. Where I think much more is happening is wealthy individuals acting as angels, making direct investments in businesses. Lots of people involved with the Giving Pledge who you work with, like the Case family and Piero Major, that are making direct investments in these businesses. And I think that transition will start to take place where they've created enough of those opportunities that then the bigger institutions can start to come in. But it is totally over.
I mean, it's one of those. One of those great Bill Gates quotes is that we tend to overestimate how much we can do in a year, and underestimate how much we can do over 10 years. And I think, this sort of strikes me as the B Corp movement, the broader impact investing movement. I mean, we're now at this point where we're feeling kind of frustrated, certainly with the impact investing, that it hasn't gone faster.
Yeah.
But maybe these things just take 10 years to get somewhere. And I guess with B Corp, we're actually in that phase of actually seeing quite a lot of excitement about the adoption of the legislation, more and more companies signing up, but possibly there'll be a period of frustration in 2 or 3 years' time, but then, then it'll hit the mainstream. And is that the sort of path you're anticipating?
Yeah, but I actually think, we've been through a bunch of periods of frustration, and like I would tell you, we'd like there to be 10 times as many B Corps already, and we feel like it's going way too slow. And on bad days, we'll sort of look at the world and say, like, come on, there's 700 B Corps, there's like 5 million companies in the U.S. What kind of impact are we actually having? So I feel like, yes, I think anything useful probably takes 10 or 20 years to happen, and we're at the very front of it, and there's a very long road, and I think there will be a bunch of false starts. There will be a bunch of problems with companies that are bad networks, and there will be a bunch of failed investments by impact investors that will pull back the space and cause everyone to say, well, we need to rethink this, sort of like it's happened in the Philippines. And so this will happen in some fits and starts like that.
But as I saying at the start, I think this really is a big idea, and it's an idea that's time has come, and our time has also, between the two of us has come, and so really it's now your time in the audience to sort of ask lots of questions. And let's start here. If you'd say who you are, there's going to be a microphone.
Wexler, Harry Wexler. I just have a question. You mentioned about Mackey, John Mackey, has another picture, and he said if you have the right kind of backers and investors, maybe you don't need to go into B Corp. And I don't think you quite
Address
gave
that.
a full response.
So I think if you're a public company in Delaware, you can't control who your investors are. So I don't know what their shareholding structure is, if there are some A shares or if he and some of the other founders control the company, but you have a duty to your shareholders. So he can do lots of things he's talking about as long as the shareholders believe that over the long term he is still maximizing their value. If he slips up, the investors will give him a much shorter leash. And if he ignores them, then they can try to do something about it. And so the reason that you need the benefit corp is I think it ensures that you can actually maintain mission, and that your investors sort of have a warning when they come in. Like, this is the way the company is going to be run. We're running it to create benefit for all stakeholders, and there is an obligation for the directors to balance those interests when they make their decisions. It happens that that hasn't happened to Whole Foods yet, but it could, because he doesn't have a say in who his investors are.
Thank you. Yeah, I think what he's been doing is very actively cultivating certain investors who have an appetite for the kind of long-term sustainable business that he's been running.
Right.
But I certainly think the period of where a lot of companies that have had a social mission are vulnerable is where there's a transition to a new management team. Maybe they hit a down period for the first time. those some shareholders, change management or whatever, and suddenly you're in a period of vulnerability. And I think that's where your hope is, that the legal,
Right.
that in a sense the management itself, the new management, could go to law to protect themselves from their own
That's right.
shareholders as well in
Yeah.
some ways. Yeah.
If the investors in a company, if there's a hiccup and the company is, share price is off, and some of those institutional investors who one was hoping were going to be there for the long term, for whatever reason, need to make a change, they've got to rebalance their holdings. I mean, institutional investors, that's what they just, they're in and out. And when that happens, and then a bunch of hedge fund investors come charging in because they see an opportunity to bottom feed, because that's what they do. They're not bad people, but that's how they function. At that point, if they own enough of the company, he can have any social mission that he wants to have. They can decide otherwise. That's their right.
Okay, some more questions.
Hi. What emphasis,
You
if
say who you are first.
Amy Cison, what emphasis, if any, do you have on reporting in terms of companies keeping accountable for their B Corp status or philanthrocapitalist status?
So companies that become B Corps have to, they get recertified every 2 years. And that recertification process involves them going back through this rating system and updating it. And so they have to maintain a minimum score of 80 out of 200 points on that rating system, and each 2 years when they go back through it, they've got to do it again.
80 out of 200.
80 out of 200.
Doesn't sound very tough.
Doesn't sound very tough, but it turns out it's pretty hard to do. I mean, we made it hard enough that there's a lot of room. And one of the interesting things has been companies, and this is totally transparent. So companies do that. If you go on our website, for every one of those 700 companies, you can see their B impact report. And what that drives, interestingly, what we've seen is a race to the top.
Yeah.
That transparency causes companies to start saying, like, gosh, how can we do better? Because they want to do better. And then there's a verification process. So we have including on-site visits on a random basis to 1 out of every 5 B Corps during their certification term, so that we can make sure that there's trust there. But the race to the top thing, I think, has been we never even thought about it, but has been one of the coolest things we've seen. I mean, Etsy, when they became a B Corp last year, they were very open in saying they just made it. They got an 80.1. and they pretty much came out to the world when they announced they'd become a B Corp, and they said, we just made it. And they had a all company meeting. They had all 300 employees of the company come to, and they agreed to spend the following week with all the employees in the company trying to figure out initiatives. Originally, it was pitched as to improve our score. What it turned into was to improve our company. And it was one of the coolest, most inspiring things I've seen. And they have all these initiatives now across the board. They've really used it as a learning tool. And we've seen that in one company after the next.
And one of the points that I guess the traditional capitalists like to make is that, with a for-profit business, you do have this one measure that tells you whether the company, or appears to tell you whether the company is going in the right direction or not, which is profit. And we don't have anything, do we? You've talked about 200 different measures. Are we ever going to get a unit of social impact measurement that we can say alongside profit?
Yeah.
I mean, 100 million social impacts.
Yeah. I hope so. I think we're a long ways away from it, in part because, this whole field of impact measurement is just still in pretty early stages, and everybody has a different idea about what social impact is, which is different than what is a dollar. And so, we've had a couple hundred years to figure out how to create IRRs and discounted cash flow analysis, and we just, we're not there yet. And so, we would say that's what an 80 or 120 or 172 on the B impact rating system for years is. It's meant to start to be that I think the problem with turning it into like sort of dollarizing that score today is that it's not. I would tell you it's just not. It's not accurate enough yet. It's not refined enough yet, and so I think it's a little bit like garbage in, garbage out. But hopefully someday you have enough data. Like this is starting to produce data on thousands and thousands of companies and what they actually do. And so I think over time that data will get used by somebody smart, who's a lot smarter than me, to figure out how to create a unit of social value.
And what's the top scores that a company's got so far?
I think somebody's like in the 160s. Yeah, the rating system is sort of divided between your practices and the underlying sort of impact on whether the underlying product or service of the business is a social good. And there are some companies that that are both, and they do really well.
There was some, lady here in the middle. We've got a mic coming to you.
I'm Aviva Mohilner, and my question is, hold on, I have to consult, we've talked about so many things, is to what would you attribute the difference in growth rate, the slower growth rate that B Corps have had, as you've talked about? Is it more that that it truly is just the expectation exceeding the reality, or are there things that you would have done differently and that you will be doing differently moving forward?
Yep, so interestingly, the growth rate and the number of B Corps has actually been about what we said it was going to be in our early projections. However, the pricing to be a B Corp is much lower than what we originally said, which is why we're only a third of the way to being sustainable instead of all the way sustainable. So, an interesting, just like, business school case study, the original companies that became B Corps, who were the most gung-ho, were also the ones willing to say yes to one pricing structure that other people who were, less just kind of out there. I mean, the original B Corp, we could have, I don't know, they might have been willing to pay anything because they were just like, yes, count me in, I'm ready to lead. And other people need a better reason than just that. And so, so the pricing, pretty quickly after the first year, we made the pricing significantly lower. But the growth rate and the actual number of B Corps has been pretty consistent. The thing that has surprised us to the upside is how quickly international interest has developed. So there are now B Corps in 25 countries around the world. And I think that part of it will start to scale very quickly, and that will grow the revenue base.
Let's go to this end of the room, right there on the left.
Hi, I'm Sophia Powell. So you mentioned that you're noticing companies are becoming B Corps because it helps them attract talent, sort of communicating that they're part of a larger social value system. And I was wondering if you've identified any other communication trends that are different from traditional businesses that are helping these social enterprises succeed.
Yeah, I have a terrible memory for statistics, so I'm gonna butcher this. But I mean, there are a bunch of interesting kind of data points from the community. Like I was telling Matthew before we started, during the downturn, B Corps went out of business at a much lower rate. In other words, they stayed alive much more successfully than other businesses of the same kind of with the same set of characteristics. And I think in part that's because of an ability to stay on mission and continue to attract a patient set of investors and bring and attract talent. There are a bunch of other statistics about their sort of their growth rates and revenues and things like that that look pretty good as well. And so the community has been very strong.
Okay, gentleman on the far left.
Hi, VJ. Would you say Thomas Edison was a social entrepreneur? With his invention of the light bulb and his purpose of inventing it was to help humanity see in everything?
Sure.
I
I mean, I think it's quite. I mean, it's very interesting that if you go back a century or so to when a lot of these big companies were being started.
Was a social entrepreneur that he invented a mechanism, an automobile where people can travel the country. Alexander Graham Bell, Fulton, all the great inventions, even Steve Jobs today with the iPhone, the iPad, etc., were social entrepreneurs. And isn't why you repackaging something to make it Google for everybody to say, oh, I'm a social entrepreneur, I'm going to change the world, when the real change in the world is coming from people who are like Edison, Jobs. Look at Microsoft. I mean, he stole the DOS system from people and changed the world and everything. But and now he wants to make up for it. And aren't these people some of them want to make up for it or something?
So, I mean, what do you think, Andrew? Is there a difference between an entrepreneur and a social entrepreneur?
Yeah, I think there's a huge distinction. I think that the distinction, in part, is about intention. So it was interesting to me. I heard one of the guys who started Twitter. I was on a panel with him right after a bunch of the Arab Spring activities. 2 years ago, and somebody said to him, there were all these stories about like it's a Twitter revolution, right? And so they must be social entrepreneurs. And so somebody asked him about this, and I sat there like, oh God, he's going to say that he created these revolutions with Twitter. And he looked at this person, he said, no, we created a really cool platform for people to do all kinds of things with. Some people, I'm going to be slightly inappropriate, it's like some people tweet about taking a dump. Some people use Twitter to start a revolution in Tunisia. We created a really cool platform. The people who are creating the revolutions are the social entrepreneurs. Who are using it to create the revolutions are the social entrepreneurs.
Well, without
and I found that really refreshing because
there would be no social revolution. And let's take the internet. The internet was formed by DARPA, right? The Defense Department as a mechanism that someone would be alive to blow up the rest of the world after we got attacked.
Yeah.
And the web and that ability created all this, whether it's Twitter, whether it's this or that. So
can you just sort of give us a question?
Well, I don't think there is someone who's a social entrepreneur. Somebody puts forward an idea to change, to make money, that changes the world. Doesn't need all this gobbledygook that you want to make feel good and etc.
Well, I mean, you've had your say. We'll answer that and move on. But I mean, it seems to me that quite clearly there are a lot of entrepreneurs that have started businesses that have actually created income for themselves and benefit for their customers, but hurt other people. I mean, I think you could arguably, there's all these people that make spam, make companies that hack it, that send spam around the world to make allies miserable, that presumably make money out of those people who make guns, which arguably, as a Brit, I think is a bad thing for them to be doing, although I'd probably be thrown out of America for saying.
Yeah, so the last thing I would say about this is, to me, what's important is to look at the overall impact of the business on society and environment. It's why we put into the benefit corp law that the purpose of the corporation is not to do some specific narrow piece of good, but to create general public benefit, which is defined as a material positive impact on society and the environment. And the reason for that is to say that there are lots of businesses that are creating lots of jobs or lots of growth, or are doing, they're making solar panels or an electric car. But if you look at the totality of the business, Walmart is the biggest seller of organic food on earth. But the thing is to look at the totality of the business, what the externalities are that the business is creating, both positive and negative, and then make a judgment on the whole business. And so at least the way we think about what's a good business is it's a business that's having a material positive impact on society and the environment, not just creating jobs or not just creating economic activity.
Okay, so we've got someone in the middle there. Yeah. Why don't we take all three of these questions in a row and so we can get plenty of questions in. So you first.
My name is Justin Hannon. Of the 700 B Corps that there are out there now,
Yep.
how many are converting from like a C or an S corporation to a B Corp? What is that process like? And do you see a lot of S Corps or C Corps trying to get the certification that you are offering?
Yeah, so,
Okay, so
yeah, sorry.
answer that, Scott.
Just to be very clear, so there's B Corp certification, you can be any kind of legal form and still get certified as a B Corp. Then there's this new legal form called a benefit corp, which is sort of like best practice, is using this new corporate form that most clearly aligns your interests. And so of those 700 certified B Corps, today, only a small number of them are benefit corps using that legal form because it's brand new. The process depends on the state, and so, but for the most part, it's a pretty easy process. You take a shareholder vote and you file some papers with the state, and you have switched your corporate form from C or S Corp to benefit.
And this certification, I mean, is that an interim phase, do you think, or is that something?
It's a great question. We debate this every day. What does success look like, and someday will there be, are there more likely to be 80,000 benefit corps or 80,000 certified B Corps? And I have absolutely no idea.
Okay, lady next to you.
Either way would be great.
Thanks so much for the session today. My name is Cindy Vandenbosch, and I actually run a benefit corporation. We just registered last May.
What's it called?
Turnstile Tours. So we partner up with nonprofit organizations and lead tours of the Brooklyn Navy Yard and other locations. But anyway, I won't get into all that. But the question that I have is actually, so part of the requirement is for us to report, right? And we're coming up on our annual report.
Yep.
And that's based on a third-party standard. And what I'm interested in is the process that B Corporation or B Lab goes through with the rating system. Do you regularly update the metrics? Who's involved in that decision-making process? If you could speak a little bit to that process, that would be interesting.
Yeah, so there's an independent, I mean, the quick answer, there's an independent standards advisory council that's been created, so it's not like Andrew's rating system with Andrew's values. That's pretty important. Made up of a bunch of industry experts, and they, every 2 years, create a new version of that rating system based on best practices and looking at the data coming back from the previous versions. And so they're constantly improving and refining the questions that are asked. And then any company can use that, and there are a whole set of improvement tools, and then there's a verification process built in as well to check on the answers. And thousands of companies are going online and using that tool for free. They just don't get a rating from us, but lots of people are using it as a tool for themselves. And anybody can go online at bcorporation.net and try it out.
Gentleman there.
Hi, my name is Toma Officer. So you mentioned that traditional investors were slow to participate in impact investing. And I just wanted to hear your thoughts on the potential for investment crowdfunding once it becomes effective to accelerate the flow of capital into impact investing.
Okay, and let's take a couple more questions from over here. There's a lady on the front row here. Yeah, so you and then this lady.
Hi, everyone's favorite topic, tax. You said that B Corps are taxed as C Corps. Do you have any ideas about changing how they're taxed? And if so, possible abuses?
Okay, if you pass the mic, close in front of you.
Mine was actually very similar. I was going to ask if, like, very many private companies, a lot of how they structure themselves is very heavily influenced by their tax benefits that they're going to get. And you mentioned that the benefit that you have with B Corps now is that they want to be B Corps. And so I'm wondering, once there are tax benefits to those companies, what is kind of separating them from nonprofits, and how would those companies know whether they should be a nonprofit or a B Corp, and what those incentives might do to the value of a B Corporation?
Why don't you take those two tax questions first,
Yeah.
and we'll look at the crowdfunding.
I mean, yeah, it's interesting. Kind of like in a perfect world, I guess, companies would be taxed in part based on how much public benefit they create. Right? You can easily measure it and easily verify it, and you have great internalizing externality, basically you're taking that stuff on yourself, then you should pay less tax. I don't think that's happening anytime soon, because I think the measurement systems are imperfect, and therefore, subject to all kinds of abuse. But what I do think can happen is all kinds of other incentives that drive businesses to higher levels of performance. And so we've been more focused on creating a platform on which businesses can behave differently and providing the standards and the other tools than we have been on taxing them differently. And that said, I hope someday there will be a system that actually does recognize and distinguish between businesses that are creating negative externalities and those that are internalizing. On crowdfunding, I think crowdfunding has huge potential to drive more capital to all kinds of small businesses that are innovative, and one group of those is the impact investing market. But on the other hand, like the crowdfunding laws are going to mean it's all small. It's going to be about startups and early stage kinds of stuff.
Yeah, so far we've got to get some ruling out of the SEC, which seems to be very slow moving.
Waiting as long as they possibly can.
I think that one of the things that we already see from crowdfunding in general is that the more there's a personal mission, a passion in the video and so forth, the more money you're likely to attract.
Yeah.
And I think that would probably mean that if you look at all the different entrepreneurs that are going to be looking to raise money through crowdfunding, that maybe the more mission-oriented ones may actually do better through that model than maybe through other forms of finance.
I think it's a good point. Like it's less intermediated, and so more chance that what the business's mission is about is what will attract the individual investors. I think that might be.
Okay, we've had two ladies who've wanted to get for a while. One in the middle there and one over here.
Kate Bronte, can you talk about wages and benefits in this whole standards conversation? Are the wages and benefits of the actual corporation itself accounted for, and then what about subcontractors? So, for example, Patagonia hires a cleaning contractor.
Yeah, great question. So the way the standards work is there are sets of questions on that address workers, community, environment, governance, supply chain, and so we ask lots of questions about the benefits that go to workers and worker ownership and other things like that. Both workers within the company, but workers through the supply chain, because it's become more and more important, obviously, particularly with larger companies, to look at their role, all their significant suppliers, and what the labor policies are there.
And then over here we've got a lady.
Oh, hi, Holly Atkinson. I work with Seed to Table, which recently became a B Corporation, and just a shout out to Seed to Table. I think we're the first fresh food company that's been certified. There are shelf-stable and other food products, but I think we're first. And we're also in the Navy Yard. And to be fair, I think my question was answered, but just as an entrepreneur and a business person, I find it tremendously frustrating that traditional corporations under the capitalist system are able to externalize. You used the word now a couple of times. I think you answered my question, but what do you see as the potential for B Labs, B Corp to impact that conversation and maybe get into the policy area? Because it's such a stacked deck that's sort of killing us. And I'd love to support the movement, the mission, the whole thing. And see if you see where that might be going, unintended consequences, maybe you'll have more of an effect in that realm.
So I think it's important to say, we have tried to build the B Corp community as a community of businesses that stand for something instead of standing against anything. And so there's a role for activism and trying to, activism and regulation to deal with companies that are creating lots of externalities. I think our hope is that as this community continues to grow and we shine a light on these businesses that are in fact are doing the opposite of creating negative externalities, that are creating benefit for society, that will start to be recognized, and then people can contrast. Where's the value that's being created and where it's not, and then other people can make decisions about whether it's regulations or activism. But our job is to facilitate businesses like you being able to succeed.
But if Barack Obama called you up and said, look, I'd like to mention you in the State of the Union, and I would call one particular policy change. You know, what would that change?
We actually wrote a sentence for him for the State of the Union, and with great hubris sent it to him. And he didn't use it.
Probably too short.
It was basically, it was basically government policy. Government policy should embrace or support businesses that are best for America. And the way that starts is by saying that any company that is doing business with the U.S. government should have to measure what matters. Forget about incentives to start. Let's just get everybody to measure what matters. Let's get everybody to start moving towards having more social impact. And once we do that and do it well and have the data, then we can start to think about.
So that's all U.S. government contractors to have to use a gears system, something like.
Or something like it. Yeah. Let's have everybody who does business with the U.S. government transparently measure what matters.
Well, I think that's a pretty good note to close on. Andrew, thanks so much for sharing your vision.